Hello. In this tutorial for the code.org AppLab environment, we're going to learn how to take a character and make him wander across the screen. And this can be real useful in a variety of different types of games that you might create with AppLab. It is recommended that you make the YouTube window as large as you can to get the best details on the code. Also, it is recommended that you manually set the YouTube video resolution as high as it can go. The first thing you want to do is you want to choose graphic or graphics for your program. I chose a graphic from an author called Warspawn of the website opengameart.org. For more information on finding art for your apps, please click on the video link in the upper right hand corner of the screen titled AppLab code.org Finding Game Art. Now let's go back to our app. I've already set this up. I've created an image called image_wizard. And I've created a program called Random Character Movement. For more information on setting up your program, please click on the link in the upper right-hand corner of the screen titled AppLab.code.org, Setting Up the Project. So now I'm ready to actually start coding. So I'm going to go to Code, and I'm going to start by creating a couple global variables. So these global variables are declared outside any functions, so they'll be available in any functions in my entire program. So I'm going to say var rand x movement, and this is going to track the direction the character is going to be moving in the x-axis. And then we'll say var rand y movement. To help other programmers understand our code, we're going to put a comment. So we're going to have 2 slashes. These slashes tell AppLab to ignore everything else on this line. So we'll say keeps track of direction and speed on x-axis. And we're going to do the same. We're going to copy and paste this for var y movement, except it'll be on the y-axis. Finally, we're going to create a countdown variable because we don't want it moving in the same x and y direction all the time. We just want it to do it till countdown reaches 0. So we're going to say var switch countdown, and then we're going to initialize it to 0. Now what we need to do is we need to create a button to click on that's going to start everything happening. So I'm going to go over to Design. I'm going to drag a button on here. Then I'm going to call it button_start. And the text of the button, I want it to say Start. Now I'm going to click on Events, and I'm going to create an event listener. So I'm going to say Insert and Show Code. So whenever I click on this button, it's going to run this anonymous function here. Now by default, whenever I click on the button, if it's running, it's going to say to the console button start clicked. And that's not what I want to happen. So I'm going to get rid of that. So I'm going to delete the console.log button start clicked. And the first thing I want to have happen is I want it to hide the button. So I'm going to have it say hide element, and then in parentheses and then in quotation marks, I'm going to say button start, because that's what I want it to hide. And then we'll end the line with a semicolon. Next, it's going to start a timed loop that's going to call a movement function over and over again. So we're going to go over here to Controls, Timed Loop. We're going to drag it down inside this anonymous function. Now this is going to run every 1,000 milliseconds. I want it to run much more often than that. I want it to run every 50 milliseconds, which is 20 times a second. If you want to speed up or slow down your character, you can increase or decrease this value. So we don't have anything to call right yet, so we're going to say to do call move function. And now we're going to write the move function, and we'll come back and fill that in. So we're going to go down here. We're going to say function move, open close parentheses. Then we've got our open close squiggly brackets, which shows the computer where the function begins and ends. Next, we need to create a local variable that's going to store the x value of the wizard. And when we get the x value, it's this corner right up here. Both for the x and y, it grabs the upper left-hand corner. So we're going to create what's called a local variable. And it's a local variable because we're declaring it, creating it inside a function. That means it's only valid inside the function that's destroyed when the function ends. So we're going to say wizard x location equals get x position and we want to get the x position of image underscore wizard. Now we're going to make another local variable for the current y location. So we're going to say var wizard y location equals get y position, and again image underscore wizard. Now what we need to do is we need to update this value based on what the value of rand x and rand y movement are. So we're going to say wizard x location equals wizard x location plus rand x movement. This doesn't actually change the location, it just helps us calculate where we want it to go. We'll do the same thing for the y. Wizard y location equals wizard y location plus rand y movement. Now make sure you've got, x location, x movement, and wizard y location, rand y movement there. If you mix them up, you're going to have some problems. Okay, so now that we've calculated where we want it to go, we can actually move it to these variables. So we're going to call the function set position, and we want to set the position of image underscore wizard. And we have to give it an x and y location where we want it to go. Notice we've got a comma here separating our arguments. So we want to move it to whatever the current value of wizard x location and wizard y location. So that's going to move it to the updated values. Now right now when we run this, rand x movement and rand y movement, we never initialized them. We never gave them a value, so they're just default to undefined. So this won't actually change. So we're going to have to give these values other than 0, and we're going to do that later on in the program. Okay, so the next thing we need to do is we need to reduce the countdown by 1. Now the countdown starts at 0, so for the first run through, it's not going to matter, but we're going to end up setting this to values other than 0, so it counts down before it changes the x movement and the y movement values. So we're going to say switch countdown minus minus. So switch countdown minus minus is going to decrease the value of the switch countdown variable by 1. It's actually programming shorthand for switch countdown equals switch countdown minus 1. It's just this is a much easier way to write it than this. This is of course a comment, so this won't affect what the computer does. This just helps us explain what we're doing to other programmers. So now that we've decreased the countdown, we got to check if the countdown has reached 0. And if the countdown's reached 0, we want to call a function that's going to reset the value of rand x movement and rand y movement. So we're going to say if switch countdown is less than or equal to 0, we're going to call a function called assign direction. Now we haven't written assign direction, so we're going to take a break from writing move, write assign direction, then we're going to come back to the move function. So we're going to create the assign direction function. So we'll say function assign direction, open close parentheses, and of course we'll have our squiggly brackets which show us where the function begins and ends. Now we've got to actually set a value for rand x movement. So we'll say rand x movement, and notice we didn't declare it again, so we didn't say var. And that's because we're using the global variable rand x movement. And since rand x movement is a global variable, it can be accessed from every function in this program. So we're going to set rand x movement to random number between -5 and +5. And that means for every frame, it's going to move either +5 in the x-axis or -5 in the x-axis. We're going to do the same for y. We're going to say rand y movement equals random number, and we want it between -5 and +5. So that every time the move function gets called, it's going to move the character between -5 on the y-axis or +5 on the y-axis. Okay, next what we need to do is we need to set a value for switch countdown. And switch countdown is going to determine how long the character moves in a given direction. So we're going to say switch countdown equals random number from 10 to 50. So that means between 10 and 50 cycles of the loop, the character is going to move in a given direction. If you want it to change more often, you'd set these numbers lower. If you wanted to change less often, you'd set these numbers higher. Okay, so Now what we need to do is we need to make sure rand x movement and rand y movement aren't 0, because if they are, the character is just going to stay there. So we're going to say if rand x movement equals 0. So you notice we use a double equals here. A single equals sets the variable equal to this value. A double equals is checking for equality. In JavaScript, we can also use triple equals, which means something a little different, but in this case, double equals versus triple equals don't matter. But we only want this if to be activated if both rand x movement and rand y movement are 0. So we're going to use double ampersands for and we're going to say rand y movement equals 0. If that's the case, we're going to want to call assign direction again, so it can give us new values for random x movement and random y movement. So we're going to copy and paste that in there, call assign direction again. So now we've written our assign direction function, so we can go back and finish up our move function. Now the issue is we are going to have our character wandering around, but it could wander off the visible screen. We don't want that. So we want it, if it hits any of the 4 edges, we want it to start moving in the opposite direction. So we're going to create a new function called checkBounce. So here at the end of the move function, we're going to call the function checkBounce, and then we're going to write it so it'll have something to call. So we're going to go all the way down to the bottom. We're going to make a final function, checkBounce. So we've got to check all 4 edges. First, we have to figure out what is the width and the height of our character. And the reason we need to know that is when we get the x and y value, it's going to pull the value of the corner right up here. And if it's going off this edge here, we don't want any of it to go off the edge. So we need to be able to calculate what this corner is. So if we know this x plus the width, we can figure out the x value here. And if we know this y value plus the height, we can figure out the y value here, so we can make sure it never even goes a little bit outside the bounds. So we're going to create a variable, var wizard width equals get property, and we want a property from our image underscore wizard, and the property we want is width. Notice our 2 arguments are separated by a comma. We'll end this line with a semicolon, and we'll call var wizard height equals get property image underscore wizard, and the property we want is height. Now we need to get the x and y position again, so we're going to create a local variable, var wizard x location equals get x position, and we'll say the x position of image underscore wizard, and then we'll make a var wizard y location equals get y location, or y position of image underscore wizard. So now that we've got all the data we need, we can check if it's going off any of the 4 edges. So first we're going to see if it's going off the bottom edge. So we'll say if wizard y location is greater than or equal to 450 minus wizard height. And the reason we're using the number 450 is this screen is 450 pixels high. So if that's the case, if that means it's going off the bottom location, then we want to set rand y movement equal to -5. Since -5 will mean it'll start moving in this direction, because y decreases as we go up, that means it'll move away from this edge. Now we got to check if it's going to go off the top edge. So we're going to say if wizard y location is less than or equal to 0, then we'll say rand y movement equals +5. So that means it'll start increasing along the y, which means it'll go back down. Now we got to do the same thing with the left and right edge. So we're going to say if wizard x location is greater than or equal to 320 minus wizard width, and the reason we're using 320 is this screen is 320 pixels wide. So if it's about to go off the right edge because it's going past that 320, then we're going to set rand x movement equal to -5. So it starts going back over to the left. And then finally, if the wizard X location is less than or equal to 0, which means it's about to go off the left edge, in that case, we need to set rand X movement equal to +5, so it starts moving to the right again. Let's just get rid of that extra curly bracket there. And now we're done with the check bounce function. So now that we've got check bounce, we can go all the way back up to our button function. And when we run the timed loop, we want it to call the move function. So this timed loop is going to execute everything inside this anonymous function here. It's going to execute it every 50 milliseconds, which is 20 times a second. And again, if we wanted to speed it up or slow it down, we could. So let's run this and see if it works. So we'll reset it, run it, and we'll hit start, which should hide the button, and then start the timed loop. And there we go. We've got our character moving around. It's changing directions, and we can see it's bouncing around. So you can imagine there's all sorts of interesting things you could do with this. You could make a click game where you tried to catch certain characters by clicking on them. You could make a shoot 'em up game where you're trying to shoot certain characters. If you want to see how to make a space shooter, click on the video link in the upper right hand corner of the screen. If you have some ideas of games and apps you can use this technique for, please tell me about what you're working on in the comments. Also, be sure to subscribe and check out some of the other videos about code.org, AppLab, and other programming topics.